This isn't a niche thing. This has lessons for us all. When birth and death come together or in the wrong order, it's very sad, but it is also interesting in the most rich and important way. And I think as human beings, we have always been interested in the meanings of death, the afterlife, and what we learn about life because we think about death. And increasingly, we're interested in birth in the same way as a sort of philosophical phenomenon, as well as anything else, what we can learn about ourselves as human beings by the ways that we think about birth. Nobody is looking at reproductive loss like that.
Welcome to Medicine Unheard. My name is Hamad, and this is where healthcare workers change conversations around health and care. In our first ever episode, we're joined by Tamarin Norwood, a talented poet, writer, visual artist, and academic researcher. In this episode, we talk to Tamarin about her book, The Song of the Whole Wide World, and her experience as a bereaved mother, being diagnosed with anhydramnios, the concept of anticipatory grief, and cultural attitudes towards reproductive loss and death. But most importantly, we discuss how we as healthcare workers shape patient experiences and, with better languages of care, can afford meaning to them in the depths of their despair. So, let's start this conversation learning more about Tamarin.
I always say I have three hats on, and they sometimes the very same hat. They kind of tend to blend. So I'm the author of this book, The Song of the Whole Wide World, which we're going to talk about. But I'm the author of that book because I'm also a bereaved mother. We lost our baby son in 2018, just after he was born. And my other hat is that I'm a researcher of the stories that families create for themselves when a baby dies around the time of birth. For 15 years before any of this happened, I used to work as an artist, and I was just going to the studio every day and doing things that artists do. And when we lost our baby, I kind of swerved that understanding I had about creativity and applied all of that knowledge. I was already working in an academic field. I had a PhD, so I had a PhD in fine art. And I sort of swerved that academic research into stories in relation to grief, and I'm now working with baby loss charities with a grant from the Leverhulme Trust to understand how families are creating meaning. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Tamarin. I wonder if we could start with your understanding of grief. In The Song of the Whole Wide World, you explore profound grief as a bereaved mother. How do you define grief, and how has your understanding of it evolved through your experiences?
So I've understood that grief is very much something that happens in the body as well as in the mind. You feel it sort of all over, and many people talk about that with grief. It's not just a mental feeling; it's a physical feeling. And I've always thought it's a sort of homesickness in a way. I feel like what you've lost is the firm ground that you once knew that you stood on in your life, and it correlates with somebody or something going missing from your life. But what you lose, apart from just that thing, that person, is the territory, the terrain that you thought you were living on, because it is so disorienting, and you have to relearn who on earth you are and what on earth the planet means. So I feel like it's a kind of homesickness for the whole world that you were in. And you asked whether there was something I felt like I'd learned through the experience. The thing that I suppose I didn't really appreciate is that we do have some capacity to craft the grief that we find ourselves in, which sounds like a strange thing to say, but we can't control the events around us, but we can have some hand in trying to craft the meaning of those events. And I think, there are points in grief where that's quite impossible, but there are points in grief where actually there is some possibility to try to intervene in your own story and the meanings it might have for you in a way that can really help. And I think that's probably what we're going to be talking about a lot, because I think that's what a lot of my work is really about.
And of course, your experience of grief and motherhood in this particular instance was with the condition of anhydramnios. I wonder if you can speak on the concept of anticipatory grief, because that was quite new for me as a healthcare worker to even understand. Grief is typically understood through its immediacy, grief strikes and shocks. But for you, it settled with the foreknowledge of your diagnosis. And even now, as I reflect on the beautiful, visceral, lucid writing that you share in such incredible vulnerability, there's also a duality to that anticipatory grief you had. One is that corporeal, real bodily anticipatory grief for your child, beautiful Gabriel, but then equally for your own body as a mother who was nurturing her child for the past 9 months. You talk very clearly about your experience of taking anti-lactation medication, decussating the production of milk, your womb crimping with pain and longing, your blood thick with love. And so there's those two folds of anticipatory grief. What was your experience?
Yes, yes, that's right. So we realized from very early on in the pregnancy that there was something wrong with our baby, and actually we only realized really what was wrong with him at the point of the autopsy. But his condition meant that there was a sort of secondary character condition, which was that the amniotic fluid all ran out, and when that happens, of course, a baby can't survive, and they're not learning to use their lungs in the womb. I'm telling you this, and probably everyone who's listening already understands this, but it meant that we could be sure, sadly, that he wouldn't survive his birth by more than a few minutes or hours at best. And so, yes, throughout the pregnancy, I was anticipating his death. And grief does begin before death. It does begin before you're bereaved, because not only are you grieving a future that you expected to have, but you really are already in a state of loss. I think that is something that is even more, well, I don't know that it's even more profound, but it's perhaps unusual when you're anticipating the death of somebody that you have yet to actually meet. When you're pregnant, it's a very strange not having met, because actually you know the baby utterly, from inside out. Somehow there's a feeling of great closeness with this creature who's inside you, and you are its whole world. So you're kind of in every pregnancy there's a sense that you're getting to know that baby, and I was doing that, but at the same time I was coming to terms with the idea that as soon as he was born, or before he was born, the closer I could get to him, by the time I actually met him, he would either have already died, or be very, very, about to die. So the grieving was very intense and important to do, because I needed to try to understand what on earth was going on and what it meant and how I could understand it while I still had a baby to understand. But of course he's inside, so it's all very abstract. Anyway, so I think that feeling of anticipatory grief, the grief absolutely begins before death. But for us, what it did mean, and I think I've said this before, and I think it is difficult to understand, but there was never a point of trauma for us. We talk a lot about birth trauma and the trauma of death and bereavement. For us, there was never a shock. We were looked after very carefully through the antenatal period and after as well, and we were always we were having tests and we were getting results and everything, and so there was never a moment of appalling shock, which I think could have been the source of trauma for us. And for me, the fact that we could anticipate what was happening meant that the moment of his birth and his death could be experienced with some joy and peace, actually, in a way that, of course, had we not expected it, it would have been a completely different experience. I felt that actually, in a strange way, my body and my mind were understanding what was going on rather differently. There was a point I remember after he died that I had the feeling that my mind, I knew he died, but perhaps my body didn't. And then I thought, well, actually, is that really true? Because my body may have always been 3 steps ahead of my mind. So who's finding out? Which part of me is finding out and is doing which bits of grief?
Through that insight, I think there's something there about reconciling, rationalizing, and reckoning with grief, especially as healthcare workers, but I think it's beyond us. There's a cultural awkwardness. I'd written down that even in our language surrounding death and grief, it's so anemic and awkward and placed between euphemisms. You know, we say perhaps
Mm.
they've passed, they've fallen asleep, they're in a better place. How would you like grief to be spoken? And in what terms and what language do you think best captures grief and offers the most meaning and sense to you in that circumstance as a bereaved mother?
So I think, yes, I think there's so much language around pregnancy, and even the word miscarriage is felt by so many parents to be completely inappropriate because it's just doesn't seem to fit the experience. I mean, I think when talking, you're absolutely right. I think anemic is a wonderful word for it. Um, it's difficult because it is such a fraught subject, and different things can hurt different people. I know that some people find the word death and dead too hard, but some people feel really frustrated when people aren't saying the word dead, and will want to say things like passed on and things. Certainly with children, we want to use literal language. We want to say died. We don't want to say gone to sleep. Um, and there are obviously ways we can try to explain those ideas to very young children, while being aware of the huge misconceptions that they might have that aren't even noticed at the time. We can perhaps talk about that. But in terms of how we can talk about it, I think sometimes it's helpful to imagine how you would talk about a problem that is less great than grief. So if a friend had a problem that didn't feel earth-shattering, I think we'd know how to talk about it. We'd say, "Oh no, that's awful. What happened?" You know, we would be normal, and we'd use normal language, the kind of language we're all happy with and familiar with. And I feel that when somebody dies, or when there is something cataclysmically, bad, it's as though we forget how to be normal around that person, and we forget what we would normally say. And actually, the most helpful kind of language that I think we can use, certainly in our social worlds, is the language we would have used anyway. Say, "I'm so sorry, how awful, how are you feeling?" Say the normal things, because one of the things that is so hurtful in grief is how you can lose friends and acquaintances, and there is this awkwardness that springs up. And the awkwardness springs up because we don't know what to say. But we do know what to say in lesser, in less, if we can imagine almost practicing, what would I say if their car had broken down and it was raining? Oh no, this is awful. I think there are ways of moving from that normal, not weird conversation and taking lessons from that and moving that into grief conversations, because at the end of the day, someone's bereaved friend is still that same person. It's just that everyone treats them differently. Um, and as healthcare professionals, I think, crucially mirroring the language that parents themselves are using. Ask the baby's name, ask if they gave the baby a name and what their name was, and then use that name, or ask if they'd like that name to be used. And again, I think that goes along with the same sort of rule of being normal, not being weird. If somebody has a baby, you would ask their name. If somebody has a baby and you see the baby, you would admire the baby. And I talk about this a lot, try to apply the normal rules of life that we are actually pretty good at to those moments of grief and death. And then actually it runs more smoothly and is more what bereaved people will probably benefit from more, I think.
I was going to mention actually, I listened to a snippet of a lecture you gave to medical students. You spoke quite rightly again about the idea of saying, admire them, acknowledge them, recognize them, see them, say how beautiful your baby is, how beautiful their little toes are, because in essence, that replaces the
Yes.
otherwise normal social rituals that we would engage in that scenario. But in that protracted moment of human suffering, you're in this very clinical, sanitized atmosphere, removed from any sense
Yes.
of normalcy. And in the very moments you're experiencing incredible depths of despair in this foreign environment, you just want that acknowledgement and human recognition, perhaps.
Exactly, beautifully put. That's right. And we know that in grief, one of the things that is difficult about the grief of reproductive loss, is that it is socially less acknowledged, partly because there's no one visibly missing. There already wasn't somebody there, and now there still isn't somebody there. People didn't get to meet the baby, and maybe people didn't know that you were pregnant if it was fairly early on, and so on. And so, and yet we know that in grief, it helps for people's grief to be acknowledged, but also the person to be remembered and spoken about and acknowledged as a person, which goes without saying ordinarily if somebody dies. And so, as I said to those medical students, in that labour ward or wherever that baby is born and died, the people around may be the entire social world of that baby. And you can give gifts to the parents that will last all of their life if you just treat that baby as a baby, and acknowledge that it is sad, that it's a beautiful baby, that they are parents, and help. And I think that's where a lot of this memory making activities go on. So often we will get a box of handprint making equipment, or a teddy, or we may bath the baby and things like that. And I think some of that is, of course, to capture records of a baby, but a huge part of it is that you are spending time with other human beings who acknowledge that this is sad, and that this is a baby, and that this is a real person who has gone, and that you can parent them. And that in that way we grow the presence. I want to say social personhood, which is a very social sciences term, but we grow the meaning, the social meaning of that baby in a way that will help parents grieve.
I also think that we too often don't see patients as they are, and in this particular setting, how they inhabit and embody identities of motherhood. And you write about the unique aspects of motherhood entwined with that experience of loss. I wonder if you can touch on how this experience in particular has shaped your identity as a mother in your bereavement and beyond.
Mm. Yeah, I'm somebody who's a mother to three children. So I have a nearly 10-year-old and a 3-year-old boy and girl, respectively, who are with us. And then, of course, Gabriel, who now would have been, I think, 6. I don't keep track of his age. Some parents really do, but I don't particularly. But I think something important for me is that I realized through this experience that being able to understand and handle and speak about and kind of manage feelings and the emotional spectrum of life isn't just a sort of nice to have, but is absolutely structural and vital in how you can, build the little lives that you're building, and that it's not in any way a sort of add-on to the practicalities and the facts of life. The feelings really are in quite great part the facts of life. So we move through life making our meanings in it all the way through. And I think that's something that I understand much better as a mother and as a parent, because of this experience, because of guiding our 3 to 4-year-old son through the loss of his baby brother. And then I think also, I do consider myself a mother to Gabriel, and I'm clearly his mother, but I consider myself to be mothering him, parenting him in some way. And I'm obviously conscious of, I feel like the book that I've written is very much his going out into the world. It's not him, but it's his story. But also something more about the fact that there are so many different ways to attend to the unique needs of any child. Every child is going to bring different needs and is going to sort of show up in different ways. And I think that you do parent a baby who's going to die, and actually a baby who's going to die, or a baby who has died, needs different parenting. So needs, for instance, if a baby's died, a parent would be parenting that baby by knowing where it is, whether it's at the hospital or the undertakers, or when the autopsy is happening, maybe who's doing the autopsy. So there are, and that feels absolutely essential to a parent, although it might feel, well, it's died. You don't really need to know where it is. So there are I think there are ways of parenting children who've died that I think might sound sort of macabre, but are actually expressions of love and softness and sadness, which are just in just the same way that any other kinds of parenting are expressions of things like that, I think. So it's all very much a continuum. I mean, I write in my book at some point, being alive wasn't what made us love our son. We loved him anyway. We didn't love him because he was alive. So we wanted to see him when he was dead. So I'll just read, it's really a paragraph, and this is taken from when we go to visit Gabriel the day after he's died. So the hospital keep him for the night he's died, and keep him in a cold cot, and then he's obviously been put into a room so that we can go and view him. And we'd left him sort of tucked into a blanket in this cold cot. And then when we came to see him, one of his little hands had been put out to grip the blanket. And this is just a paragraph about how we felt about that. And then a little hand had been posed where the blanket was folded, as if to grip it, to give the impression of a baby asleep. Perhaps the midwife had arranged him thus in desperation, not wanting to present us with a baby so dead. But she needn't have worried. It wasn't being alive that made us love him. Dying had been Gabriel's way since the very beginning, and here he was, all grown up and left home, I want to say, or safely ashore, having rowed his little boat all the way across, further than Anton or I have ever travelled. Anton's my husband. I suppose this is to say that in the composure of his body, in his completeness and resolve, I was proud of him. I mean, I think there are many ways to love a baby, whether they're alive or dead. And I think one thing that I thought again and again was the sense that I would not find out what Gabriel made of it all. I would never find out. I mean, I also did a certain amount of reading into what kind of thought a newborn brain is capable of, what kind of sensation and so on. So I'm aware that there are clearly limitations, but I felt strongly that the fact that I would never be able to glean what he was making of the world seemed to be almost an expression of his independence from me, as if he was all grown up and leaving home. So I think there are many parallels in looking after and loving a baby who is dying or has died, with the more familiar ways of loving a child who is living and well. I thought I'd also read that extract. I think this is a nice little page to read out because it describes a period of time after Gabriel has died, and he's lying in my arms, and we're in the labour ward where he was born and died, and just various people come in and out of the room, and I just wanted to read a little description of how that felt to us, and something that I think there's a lot of lessons that could be learned, because it was beautiful for us, and I wish it would happen to everybody. So there came a doctor who regretted that she needed me to complete a form. So I turned onto my back again and was helped to sit up, and a biro was put in my hand. 2 women in scrubs stopped at the door to come and admire the baby. They seemed to know me, although I couldn't place them. I was glad of the admiration. I wanted more people to come and see him, anyone. I recognised a consultant who'd prepared the raft of measures we never needed because he never showed distress. She'd seen my name on the whiteboard and wanted to say hello. Another woman, very tall, hair scraped back, brought a clipboard with the autopsy consent form. I was holding Gabriel in my arms again, and there was a moment's deliberation as she hesitated with the clipboard in the air, and I transferred the baby to Anton's arms. The neatness of the exchange, a dead baby for his autopsy consent, had all the symmetry of a well-crafted joke. A horror all resolved when she thanked us and said goodbye, and that she was sorry for our loss. With these words, she became somebody who loved Gabriel too, and whom I could easily love. Still drowsy with feeling, I loved all the people who came to see him. And I just think that's worth sharing because it was such a gift. I can imagine that seeing my name on the whiteboard, people might feel nervous to come in and see me and a baby who's died. And actually, people who didn't need to come in. And I wouldn't have known that they'd chosen not to come in. So I feel it was a really selfless gift of care that has stayed with me, because it felt like a special time, as it should when you've got a new baby. Because look, I've got this wonderful baby. Everyone look at the baby, look. And you don't get much of that when a baby's died, sadly, because not many people do see the baby. So that moment of, it felt festive. It felt celebratory. People were coming in to see the baby. Um, Now, I'm aware that obviously we'd anticipated the death of our son, and I think the situation would feel very, very different in the room with a death that hadn't been anticipated. Um, but I think there are always, and I've shared that idea that we must admire the baby, widely among parents I work with and I speak to, bereaved parents, and everyone seems to be in agreement. Admire the baby. If there are ways to do it in a way that is honest and true, and you mean it, and um, feels right in the situation that we're in, because of course the death of a baby can happen in many, many different ways, and the room can feel many different things. But anyway, that's a lesson that I felt I would love to be learnt widely from our experience, from our very good experience.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Tamarin. That was beautiful. I wanted to touch on this other aspect of grief you make reference to, internalizing the condition, the diagnosis, the experience, and ultimately bearing responsibility and guilt. I think in some places you also liken your womb as an opportunity for Gabriel to stay, for you to continue to nurture and nutrify that relationship with him. How was that experience in feeling the burden of responsibility and guilt? I think as healthcare workers, it's so important for us to understand that patient experience and to help them through it, to reconcile with that experience rather than fostering guilt.
Oh, such a good question. Yes. I hear from so many parents who say, people compare their wombs to, you feel like it's a coffin or a tomb. You can feel like, and I think a lot of the time the language that is used around, difficulties in pregnancy, things like incompetent cervix and incompatible with life, and miscarriage in itself. And, what's the word for people, very older women, who I was when giving birth, but geriatric pregnancy. There are a lot of words that are obviously in healthcare one gets used to, but when you hear it as a parent, they can carry a lot of weight. And I think, if it's possible to avoid technical terminology when it includes words like incompetent or incompatible with life, I think that can help assuage parents' feelings of guilt. We always feel like we are responsible for what's happening with our children. And so there isn't always going to be questions of, could I do something better? And I think also, I think pregnancy is always a time where we not only logical thought counts. Parents expecting parents are always making up stories and dreaming and imagining and thinking of the way that their child would be, and kind of creating imaginary relationships with them, and that's absolutely necessary. That's bonding, and that's what we do before birth. But what it means is that you are open to this kind of almost magical thinking at the best, always at the best of times and at the worst of times. So you're going to be searching desperately for meaning. It's like the mind, space abhors a vacuum. What's the phrase? And I think we abhor having no meaning. As human beings, we need meaning, and so we will create it. And so guilt can well be a part of that. So I think it's a matter of being sensitive to the language that we use. And I think also at any opportunity saying, this isn't your fault, this isn't something you've done, where that's an appropriate thing to say. Yeah. But I had very clear, lucid images of my body as, the world that he's living in. He's somehow, I'm the world, and I'm the parts of me that could look after him are sort of on the outside of myself, but he's on the inside of myself. And so, yeah, it's very rich symbolic time, pregnancy, which can go either way, can be used, can be used to construct love, and it can be used to construct grief and guilt.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. On the topic of our language of care, it's a learning we aren't really afforded in our education as future doctors, nurses across the allied health workforce. In understanding how we can capture meaning too, I sort of conceptualize our roles as clinical conduits, like you say. We try to grapple with a sense of suffering and meaning that our patients present themselves with and allow that to rise to the surface air, let it oxidize, ameliorate, giving language to it, as you say, but a language that is translatable and meaningful to our patients. I think that's quite important. And this isn't some sort of fringe academic discussion that we're talking about, because it's in essence our role and what we're trying to do, centering our patients' care, concerns, and curiosities. And talking about storytelling too and making sense of meaning. You did a talk with the Feminist Library a few months ago and mentioned how the priests and the poets and the doctors and the midwives and the mystics were convening their knowledge to provide you with the meaning that you were demanding in experiencing your grief. I wonder perhaps if you can touch on that too, and how healthcare workers, but beyond healthcare workers, because you also talk about the intersectionality with spirituality, how you found meaning, but then how we can help as healthcare workers, patients find their meaning too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's so, where do I start? Because that's such a fantastic question. I did get a strong sense that there was a point when the medics around us had a good sense of how and when to retreat, and how to share the kind of table of expertise with other sources of expertise. And I think what that really means is being keyed into. I mean, we talk about the humanities, which is about humans, and how the human kind of experience, and how that experience has been rendered through poetry and through art. And the fact is that I always think that really feeling and meaning is what is transmitted through the humanities in so many ways, and transmitted through time. And we have expertise that's built up over generations and over millennia, because the doctors have their expertise, which you'll know all about, and which I know much less about. But there are other forms of expertise that also have long histories, that have there are people, poets and mystics and priests, as I describe in the book, who have developed precision instruments for understanding feeling and sensation and meaning. And very often those precision instruments are carried down in poetry, not in practice, or in medical textbooks, or in medical journals, but that expertise is carried through other kinds of writing and other kinds of knowledge sharing, and in liturgical texts and in scriptures and in religious beliefs and so on. These things build up over millennia. So there is real expertise in the world, and it's held by lots of different kinds of people. And I think at a point, things like birth and death are so thick with meaning, that I felt it was really courageous and impressive of the medics around us to understand that they had expertise that we absolutely needed, and there was other meaning and other things that were important. If it was just the medical expertise that we needed, I wouldn't have needed anyone else to come into the room. But there were medics who thought, I do have a clinical role here. I'm coming in because actually I understand what things mean. So yeah, I felt that was quite important, and I think something really practical the healthcare workers can understand is the way that things can symbolize other things. So I mentioned the autopsy report, and sort of swapping the baby for the autopsy consent form, and how clearly that could have been read by me as a symbolic kind of exchange of my beloved baby for bureaucracy, and a kind of hospital rules and regulations taking over, and him kind of becoming and actually I think that the people in the room were conscious of that potential symbolism, and I felt that was diffused by that doctor saying, I'm sorry for your loss, and there were so many other moments of possible symbolism. And I've spoken about this before, but the if you're choosing a coffin for your baby and a shroud, and choosing about how the funeral will go, well, that feels a lot like nesting, which is the kind of practice that parents go through before they have a baby. They get the nursery ready, and they'll this nesting idea. Well, it feels rather like nesting when you're preparing a funeral for a baby before the baby's born. So to be alive and aware of that symmetry, clearly, even if just to say, just to understand that this might feel like what they get instead of preparing a nursery, and how heavy that is. Or, taking that pill to suppress lactation, what that is you get a pill instead of all the lovely hours you might spend in close contact with your baby, sharing, giving milk to. So that's another point of symbolism. So just to be aware of what symbolic resonances might lie under things that seem tiny, or things that seem like a factual or bureaucratic exercise can actually be weighted with meaning. And all it takes is to, as I've, is to have sad eyes, to acknowledge, to sort of feel like, to say I'm sorry for your loss, and to always be conscious that there could be a symbolic mirroring between what you're doing and what that parent should be doing with a living baby.
I think that's such an important lesson for us to take. Thank you again for sharing that. You mention again in your book about how grief can impact relationships and families, and just reading a quote that's so pertinent to it, you write, "On the day of our wedding, we didn't know what marriage was, a leap of faith. But when we held our silent son, Gabriel, we knew this was our renewal of our vows. This, so far at least, was what marriage meant." I believe as healthcare workers, we too often forget that we're never just dealing with that singular patient in front of us. Yes, there's values, beliefs, and expectations informed from socioeconomic and cultural leanings, but then there's also families and friends and everyone that patient has ever loved. Disease, despair, disorder, they diffuse across those relationships too. And I wanted to ask your experience of that. How was your relationships affected? And then perhaps, how can we as healthcare workers value that insight, respecting, acknowledging, and at times perhaps directly tending to those bonds of grief beyond that singular patient?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I think it's true. It must be quite difficult to keep a handle on that, within healthcare, because it feels quite far removed from the matter in the, in the consulting room or wherever we are. I think that, at times of grief, I mean, I remember saying to my husband, we're going to need to grow whole extra limbs to carry the weight of this grief. I don't know how there can be this much sadness and we somehow stay the same shape. So it felt, we have changed. And I think very often, different people, I mean, stereotypically, men and women will grieve reproductive loss differently. That's the kind of classic stereotype, and yet it seems to pay out time and again. In the sense that sometimes you'll find that the father's trying to find solutions, and the mothers are trying to stay with the feelings and things like that. I don't want to deal in stereotypes, but in any case, if you've got two people going through something that they've never been through before, that they're enormous, and they are dealing with things in different ways, then it can create sort of tensions, and it can create misunderstandings. People can feel, well, why aren't you sad about this? And the partner will say, but of course I am sad, I'm just not showing it in the same way as you, and so on. So I think you'll probably be encountering families who are in the middle of completely redefining who they believe themselves to be, growing extra limbs to carry all the grief, and also redefining, how they're engaging with and relating to those closest to them, and how that can be looked after. I suppose. I mean, honestly, I don't really know, because I want to say things like signposting, letting people be aware that there are different charities, and actually letting people know that there are charities for bereaved fathers. There are charities for, specifically looking at, for instance, IVF, and difficulty conceiving in the first place, and difficulty with fertility. And there are, LGBTQ supporting charities, and some charities will we know that ethnic minorities face a lot of barriers to bereavement care in baby loss, and that can be something that can. So there are some charities that will feel more like they're opening their doors, and some charities will feel less like they're opening their doors, which is particularly devastating, because we know that Black and Asian families are more likely, by double or something like that. But the statistics are terrible to experience baby loss, and yet they're going to be more likely to face barriers to bereavement care. So I think it's about being aware of where the signposting is and where the real signposting is. So we're not going to want just a blanket, these are the charities, but actually, which charities really do what they say, and that kind of thing. Because I suppose, and I talk about signposting because I suppose I'm just not sure how far out healthcare professionals do go in looking after their patients. But it is absolutely part of the picture, and I think it's undistinguishable from the rest of the experience. I think for a patient, it's all lumped in together, isn't it? You don't spend one day thinking about your relationship with your partner and another day thinking about your baby. It's all one and the same. So it's this absolutely brilliant question to ask. I don't know how well I can, how well I've answered it, but it needs a lot of thought, doesn't it?
At the close of this conversation, I just want to touch back on the title of the book. In describing various foundational elements and features of the book and your experience, you say at one point, it all arrives at a picture of a world that completely consists of and is drawn together by the material force of love. And the resonance of that earthbound love, the sound it makes, that's the song of Gabriel's world. I just would like if you're able to touch on the inspiration and the meaning behind the title of the book and what it holds for you. I remember understanding, oh, that's the song of Gabriel. But then the concept of the whole wide world, I think at one point you mentioned that this experience and Gabriel's coming made you understand the meaning of the whole wide world too.
I felt strongly that he didn't make it far enough into the world to know much more about it than love. And of course, that's my interpretation. But I'm conscious of various definitions of love as they go back through time, and I'm always particularly struck by a kind of medieval conception of love. Dante was a medieval Italian poet, and he wrote about love as being a force that, if you were a thinker at that time, you were a Christian in Italy. So he binds up all of his philosophy with Christian thoughts, and I mean that's massively simplifying, but so his conception of love and his conception of physics and his conception of the way that the planets move, it's all God's love. Now I'm an atheist, but the concept that the idea that there is this force so strong that it binds the planets into movement, and it's the same force that binds the mother to her child, and that actually it feels to me like we can call that force whatever we want, but I was very drawn to the feeling that this isn't somehow sentimental. This is practically physics. This is a bare fact of existence, that a mother loves her baby and must be with her baby, and the sense that Gabriel, because he was a creature that barely made it out into the world, was made of love in that physics sense. He was this creature that understood nothing more than love, and that he went back into the soil. And I say back, he didn't come from the soil, but there's this sense that he went back into the world that brought him out. And so there is this real sense that it is such an elemental love, and such an elemental, I mean, his life was so elemental. It didn't have any of the nonsense that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so I think he briefly opened one eye and glimpsed. And I have read about newborn sight, and I think he will have really seen absolutely nothing. Of course not. It was for such a brief fraction of a moment. But there's this sense that he opened an eye onto the whole of the whole wide world, and that's its resonance, all drawn together by physics, the physics of love, and going back into the world at the end. So I felt that there was a deeply kind of atheist and unsentimental fact that is love, and that is all that we are composed of, or something like that. And that was the sense of it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was beautiful. And to finish off, what is the primary message that you hope readers, particularly healthcare workers, can take away from this beautiful, visceral, lucid, and affecting book, The Song of the Whole Wide World?
I think that there are many small lessons within the book for healthcare professionals, and I'm one of the most wonderful things is hearing health professionals have read it and are their perspectives and their practices are being influenced by it, which means the world to me, as you can imagine. For a general reader, I think the lesson is that this isn't a niche thing. This has lessons for us all. The experience of when birth and death come together or in the wrong order, it's very sad, but it is also interesting in the most rich and important way. And I think as a society, as human beings, we have always been interested in the meanings of death and what death, the afterlife and what we learn about life because we think about death. And increasingly, we're interested in birth in the same way as a sort of philosophical phenomenon, as well as anything else, what we can learn about ourselves as human beings by the ways that we think about birth. Nobody is looking at reproductive loss like that, and it needs to be looked at and it needs to be understood, because we learn so much about the human condition, about love, about life, if we can understand what it means to love a baby in anticipation of its death, to mourn the death of a baby before it, got a chance to live its life. It's a rich and important thing which could be much more central in our lives. So I think it's not niche. It's not niche. It's something that we could all understand and learn from. And then as for healthcare professionals, I think it's that lesson again about admiring the baby, but also what else that brings with it. So why admire the baby? Because try to think about the baby as a normal baby. How do you look after somebody when they're grieving? Try to think about it as a normal thing and engage with them as you would in any other normal conversation. I think so much of the difficulty in trying to understand what people are going through comes about because we think that the person that we're dealing with, we think that the bereaved person is somehow no longer the same thing as us. And if we can do away with that difference and think they have the same kind of love as they would for a baby who's living, this is the same as a baby who's living, this is the same kind of person as they were before. I think if you can extrapolate that lesson out into everything that you do, I think that is where a lot of the lessons kind of get their wisdom, really.